Hello everyone! Welcome to another episode of Reddit Reactions, or Reacting Reddit, actually. Yeah, that's what we're called now. My name's Jack. I'm your host today. And today, we're going to be talking about the Boeing 737 Maxes, because they are back in the sky. And if you don't know anything about that, well, I'm here to help you remember. This is something that started a year or two ago when a second Boeing 37 Max crashed, okay? And so basically the two sides of the argument are accidents happen, come on, this is only a second plane crash, yada yada. Whereas the other argument is like, hey, these companies are giant, huge, and greedy, and if we don't punish the crap out of them when they make mistakes, they're gonna keep letting people die. And I'm personally on that side of the argument. So let me give you some context before I get into some of what these people are gonna be saying. Basically, Boeing was in a position where they were highly incentivized to compete with their competitor. Their competitor was putting out a new engine, right? And because of the way the competitor had designed the plane was higher off the ground, so they could just make a bigger engine, and it didn't really affect the angles that the plane would fly at, right? Because when you're flying, depending on how your plane is, what plane you're flying, you're gonna tend to go a little bit higher, or your nose will go up a little bit more, and that's what the plane does, right? And the pilot just knows that and is used to it and counters it, basically. But so the competitor's plane didn't change its trajectory, right? They were able to use the same pilots with the same training for their competitor, but Boeing was freaking out about that, because if that competitor plane by Airbus was successful, then Boeing would lose tons and tons and tons and tons of money. They need to be the company that you buy your plane from. That's what they want. They want to keep that spot, right? So they too, in response to the competitor, made a bigger engine, right? But the problem with the Boeing plane was that it was already closer to the ground. So they couldn't just add a bigger engine. And they had to change the engine and offset a little bit. So they pushed the engine up. And this meant that the engines actually went slightly above the wings. And this meant that in actual application, you cannot treat these planes as the same plane to the pilot, because one has a tendency to lift its nose up very high, right? And you don't want that, because if you lift your nose up too high as a plane, you eventually pass the point where you're actually going to start falling. Your thrust isn't high enough to be vertical, right? It's not like a rocket. So that was an issue. That was a big issue. And Boeing countered this by adding some software to counterbalance that fact that the nose is going too high, right? But they decided to still tell the pilots and the trainers that it's the same plane. But that's fundamentally not true from the pilot's perspective. Not only does the plane actually its nose goes up, or it nose dives for no reason, that's happening because there's software that the pilots weren't properly trained about that was counterbalancing. So without the pilots being told properly, there was software that was making their plane nose to the ground. And when you're flying in the air, your nose going too far to the ground results in you dying. So that's a very bad thing, right? So the pilots were fighting this nose dipping to the ground thing that Boeing had put software in that was making that happen to counterbalance the fact that they changed the engine so that the nose rises, right? But something was wrong with the software that the pilots didn't even know existed. So it was causing the software to overcompensate and literally push the plane to the ground. And the pilots noticed it last minute, and they were able to disable it, and then it was too late and they all died. So what people say about that is that, oh, you know, Boeing's a big company, they have so many flights, this is just a second time, it's not that big of a deal. But that's the problem. That's exactly the problem. These companies, especially things like Boeing, they have so much money and so much time, they shouldn't be making these mistakes. And that's the reality. Wasn't even caused by like some human not being paid enough and then not paying attention. This was literally caused because Boeing rushed and they wanted to be able to compete. And they did compete, and they out-competed the Airbus model. But you can basically look at it this way. Boeing chose to rush production of their 737 MAX so that they could outcompete their competitor, and they won. They rushed the production, they earned more money, and they killed about like 340 people in the process. To them, that's acceptable. And that's the fucked up part. That is the part that makes it so important that this is blown up to be a very big deal. Because if these companies like Boeing are able to just get away without huge repercussions from those 340 people dying, that just becomes the acceptable norm. That's the way these big CEOs look at it. Like if you're earning $1 million or, $1 billion, however much money, there's an acceptable amount of human casualty as a result of that. And you may not want to say that, no, that's not true, that's evil. That is real. Almost every big company eventually looks at itself and is like, okay, we have so many people that occasionally accidents happen and people die. Because that's true, it's always happening. But then it lets them have this mentality that that's okay. And then people start dying preventably. These people didn't have to die. If Boeing had focused on producing the best quality aircraft it could have, it would have lost money and these people would still be alive. But of course, it gained money and the people died. And it's really important to make a big deal out of it. So for this one thing, from my perspective, it's actually like, usually the media makes a big deal out of stuff they shouldn't. But I actually believe that Boeing deserves all of this crap, and they deserve to be given all this shit. Because if they don't, they're going to keep doing these things, and people will die. And that's just how it is. Like, it's not like Boeing feels bad that these people die. Like, they'll say that they feel bad, but, they're CEOs and stuff. They're really detached from the actual planes and pilots themselves. All right, so now let's see what Reddit has to say about this now that I have blabbered on to you about context for like 10 minutes. Whoa, this is a really epic post by Cat of the Decade talking about if this is a blown out of proportion story or if it's deserving. So let's see what they have to say. No, this is a measured, appropriate response. It's a significant issue that has a real demonstrable potential to affect safety. This deserves an in-depth investigation of both the aircraft itself as well as the system that allowed it to get to its present state. Why can we not settle on Boeing not producing a perfect product? Because when we settle, people die. When you hear people say aviation regulations are written in blood, this is what they mean. Nearly all of them come after lives have been lost or people have suffered severe injury. Alaska 261 crashed because Alaska asked McDonnell Douglas if a cheaper lubricant could be substituted, and MD said, "We don't recommend that, but legally we can't stop you." Then Alaska asked MD if a lesser maintenance schedule could be substituted, and MD said, "We don't recommend that, but legally we can't stop you." Then Alaska 261's elevator locked up, and despite heroic work by the pilots, the aircraft clashed. Alaska said, "But MD never said no." United 232 crashed because engineers at Douglas said, "Yeah, we've got 3 hydraulic systems for redundancy, but it's okay to route them all through the same box." When the tail engine failed, debris punctured that box and destroyed all 3 systems. Thanks to the incredible discipline and skill of the pilots, many passengers survived that crash landing. Northwest 255 crashed on takeoff because of the pilots, who were otherwise skilled, experienced, and well-trained, skipped a few checks in the checklist. Specifically, they failed to set the flaps for takeoff. Everybody died. Eastern 401 crashed because the pilots became obsessed with troubleshooting a relatively minor failure. Everybody on board died. ValuJet 592 crashed because a contractor didn't follow proper procedure for handling hazardous materials, and because the federal aviation industry didn't require smoke detectors in the cargo hold, even after being warned to do so after a similar incident 8 years prior. But you have to submit some of those regulations are excessive, people say. I say look at Delta 1141. The pilots ignored the sterile cockpit rule, which bans non-essential conversation during critical stages of flight, presumably because they thought it was excessive. They forgot to stick to the checklist and crashed on takeoff. 14 more people died. Dozens were injured. The list goes on and on. When the incident is preventable, we try to find a way to prevent it from happening ever again. Even when it's not preventable, we do our best to mitigate those issues through training. See windshear. Delta 191 crashed before the phenomenon was widely understood. So when my flight is delayed because the flight crew feels something is unsafe or needs additional attention, or when my schedule gets bumped because the MAXs were taken out of service and we're waiting on backup aircraft, or when my flight is canceled due to weather that I can't see at the destination airport, I don't get upset. Instead, I'm grateful that we have systems and people in place making sane decisions in the name of safety. Dang, that was an amazingly informative post. Look at that. They brought up like 4 different examples of airplanes crashing based on little individual things, right? And the point here is that airline regulations are really, really important because they do prevent loss of life. However, it is important to understand that given all this stuff, people still die way more frequently in car crashes. Way more frequently. Like your chance, even if the airline industry's death rate was to double, your chance of dying in an airplane as an average consumer is closer to being struck by lightning than your chance of dying in a car or by a car someone else is driving. Cars are really likely to kill you. So in that way, like if you look at it that way, not as many humans are dying because of flights as humans who are dying because of cars. But whenever a whole plane loses all of its humans, that's a big deal, right? So it's inherently scarier for that reason. And at least with cars, you could argue that you have something to do with it. You know, you could have chosen to turn, or maybe you could have saved yourself. Maybe you did save yourself. Whereas in a plane, you are completely vulnerable. You're basically a baby in the savannah in Africa, and there's a guy with a gun who's protecting you. It's like, you can't do shit. That guy with the gun, he might be able to scare away the lions and the hyena, but you definitely can't. And actually, if you cry, you're going to draw attention. So you're either going to do nothing or do something and make it worse. That's basically how it is on an airplane. You can't do anything once you're up there. And so I think that kind of makes it so scary for people. And that's another reason that people are able to appropriately respond to this. And that's what's something that's so funny to me. Like, I think that this is an appropriate response in the industry. But at the same time, I wish that people would bring this much flack about all these other things that are happening that cause people to die or live miserable lives. But they're not, even though those situations where people are dying and having miserable lives are way more common than people dying in an airplane, you know? But hey, that's what life is, right? So let's move on. Let's see what other comments people have about this. Strider says, Northwest 255 crashed on takeoff because the pilots, this is a response to the previous, the pilots, who were otherwise skilled, experienced, and well-trained, skipped a few checks in the checklist. Specifically, they failed to set the flaps for takeoff. Everyone died. Strider says, in response to that, I'm being that guy, but there actually was a sole survivor. The sole survivor of that crash was 4-year-old Cecelia Cichan of Tempe, Arizona? Romulus firemen found her still belted in her seat, covered in blood and soot. She was found several feet from the bodies of her mother. What? Cecelia sustained severe burns and fracture to her skull, collarbone, and left leg. She arrived at the hospital initially in critical condition, but later managed to make a full recovery. After the crash, Cecelia lived with her maternal aunt and uncle. who shielded her from public attention until 2013 in Birmingham, Alabama. Whoa, wait. Okay, we got to learn about Cecelia Cichan? Let's see. Cecelia Cichan. What? That's amazing. They've got to make a movie about her at some point, huh? That's insane. Imagine being the only sole survivor of a plane crash at 4 years old. I want to learn about that. How did she survive? She was one of 154 people. How did that happen? Is it because her body was so small? What? Wow, okay, so there is a documentary called Sole Survivor. What? Okay, I want to see what's the science behind that? How did this person survive? Fascinating. All right, so yeah, it talks more about the surgeries that she had after being found. But it doesn't talk about the physics that talk about how... Oh, wow, okay, hear this. In an interview with The Mirror, she said that the pain from her injuries has faded over time, but she still has a tattoo of an airplane on her left wrist. Wow. Ooh. That makes me want to get a tattoo of the cancer symbol. Because my dad died when I was a kid, and that, like, completely changed my life, you know? But, wow, this girl has a tattoo of an airplane on her wrist after being the sole survivor of that crash? That's fucking amazing. Talk about balls. Wow. Man, I bet she appreciates her life. Holy crap. That's insane. She was so young, though. I can't imagine that. Well, now I know that I want to learn more about the physics that allow people to survive crazy, crazy crap. The only comment I could find about how she survived was that her mother had shielded her. So, I always thought that was just a thing in movies. I didn't know that actually putting your body over someone else could actually save them. I know that in car crashes and stuff, that usually doesn't do anything. Like, you know how parents, if you're riding in the side passenger seat of the car, or the passenger seat of the car, when something happens, they'll like put their arm in front of you. But like, that's so, it's like, it shows they care about you, but statistically that's not going to do anything if they crash. Definitely not. All right, let's see. The OP says, I should have changed settle to accept. I did not mean to imply that we should settle on a bad product. We should accept that the problem was a technical issue in Boeing's product and that they absolutely need to correct this issue. My reason for posting was to gauge whether or not that the investigations needed to go past Boeing. From your response and many others, it seems like it absolutely does. Yeah, investigate everybody, guys. All right, everybody. I think that's it for now. If you want to make this kind of content, please reach out to us. You can get in touch with us by going to our YouTube channel, clicking about, doing the captcha code, and getting our email address. Then sending an email saying hello. We want to have a Zoom call with you. Or if you like this kind of content just for the listening purpose, please comment below. Let me know what kind of stuff you want to listen to. If there's any specific thing you want to share that I can read, go at it. I'll make a video about it. All right, everybody. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Ciao.